In the final years of the 19th century, Wilmington, North Carolina, was a prominent beacon of Black progress and resilience. Here, a thriving Black community rose to prominence despite the lingering shadows of slavery and the aftermath of the Civil War. Wilmington was more than just a city. It was a representation of what could be achieved when opportunity and ambition were allowed to flourish. But it was this very success that made them become a target. In 1898, Wilmington was the largest city in North Carolina, and its demographics were a progressive deviation from the normal. Most of the population was made up of Black citizens, and their influence was cut across politics, business, education, and other sectors. Black professionals like doctors, lawyers, and entrepreneurs thrived together with skilled laborers and tradespeople. The government of Wilmington was racially integrated, with Black men holding esteemed positions. This was a rare and remarkable reality in the post-Reconstruction South, where deep-rooted racism sought to suppress Black successes at every point. At the center of Wilmington's success was The Daily Record, a Black-owned newspaper that gave voice to the community, championing civil rights and challenging racist ideologies. The Daily Record stood as a testament to the power of Black journalism in a dispensation where oppression and prejudice spread like wildfire. But as Black citizens in Wilmington rose to prominence, their achievements ignited a storm of resentment among white supremacists. This is the story of the Wilmington Insurrection of 1898, a terrible moment in American history that exposes the extreme lengths white supremacy would go to truncate the progress of the Blacka just to maintain power. This event began as a peaceful and prosperous community that was transformed into the site of the only coup d'etat in United States history, a violent overthrow of a legitimate government that was influenced by hatred and racism against the Blacks. The Wilmington Insurrection was not just an attack on a single city, but an attack on an idea. The notion that Black Americans could rise, lead, and prosper in a nation still struggling with its racist roots. The violent event of November 10, 1898, was a well-planned campaign of violence, displacement, and deceit. It was a chilling reminder of how far those in power would go to preserve a system built on inequality. In the coming moments, we'll expose the events that led to the insurrection, dissect the forces that fueled it, and expose the devastating consequences that lingered long after the smoke cleared. I know you don't know, but Wilmington was a symbol of hope and progress that was turned into a graveyard of Black dreams. Its people betrayed, its history distorted, and its legacy hidden in the shadows of American memory. Beyond the tragedy, this story is also a testament to Black resilience. Despite the horrors of the insurrection, the legacy of Wilmington's Black community continues to stay alive. Their achievements, their courage, and their sacrifices are a reminder of the strength it takes to fight for justice and the importance of remembering the past to shape a better future. Like this video, as we look closely into one of the darkest chapters in American history, a chapter that demands to be told, understood, and never forgotten. Before we dive deeper, let's explore the events of 1898. We must first look back to the Reconstruction era. This was a time of profound change and opportunity for Black Americans. Years after the Civil War, the federal government implemented policies that were focused on integrating formerly enslaved people into society as free citizens. The Reconstruction Acts, constitutional amendments, and various federal initiatives laid the groundwork for Black men to vote, hold public office, and establish businesses. In this era, Wilmington, North Carolina, became an example of what was possible when progress was allowed and given a room of expression. Wilmington was the state's largest city, situated along the Cape Fear River and a critical economic hub due to its thriving port. Towards the end of the 19th century, the city was majorly populated by Blacks, which made it one of the most racially integrated urban centers in the southern region. Black residents in Wilmington did not just survive, they thrived. The city became a haven for Black entrepreneurs, educators, and politicians who were rebuilding the social fabric of the South. It wasn't perfect as racism persisted, but Wilmington offered a glimpse of what a multiracial democracy could look like in the post-slavery era. Black Wilmingtonians carved out a remarkable degree of economic independence during this time. Black-owned businesses were very common along the city's streets, catering to both black and white patrons. Businesses like grocery stores, barbershops, and real estate companies were included. One of the most iconic examples was the Daily Record, the city's black-owned newspaper. The Daily Record became a vital platform for advocating civil rights and addressing racial injustices. It was being edited by Alex Manley. Education also had a significant role in the success of the community. Some underfunded black schools were staffed by passionate teachers who were committed to uplifting their students, unlike their white counterparts. Some institutions, like the Gregory Normal Institute, prepared young black men and women for leadership roles in business, education, public service, and other fields. Politically, Wilmington's black population had quite a strong voice. Many black men were members of the Republican Party, which at the time was the party of Lincoln and Reconstruction. Wilmington's Fusionist Coalition, which was an alliance between black Republicans and white populists, took control of local government in the 1890s. This coalition created serious tension in the political atmosphere, threatening the traditional dominance of white Democrats. Black politicians served on the city council, holding positions like Justice of the Peace, and actively participated in influencing Wilmington's policies. For a brief moment, Wilmington's progress seemed unstoppable. Black residents were not just laborers or tenants, but were business owners, landholders, and prominent leaders of the community. They had carved out spaces of autonomy and influence in a society that had been built to oppress them. However, the successes of Wilmington's black community were not perceived as a good narrative by everyone. As the black community began to prosper and gained more political power, a backlash among white supremacists who felt their dominance was eroding them was ignited. The Democratic Party, which had been outmaneuvered by the Fusionists, sought to regain control by any means necessary. To these white elites, seeing black men holding public office and black families achieving economic stability became a threat to the racial hierarchy they were desperate to maintain. These white elites were not the only ones who were angry at the blacks' progress. Poor white farmers who had been courted by the Populist Party were also vulnerable to the rhetoric of racial division. Instead of uniting with black citizens over shared economic struggles, many were influenced by white supremacist propaganda that framed black people as the root of their problems. As though that wasn't enough, white-owned media exaggerated the narrative, making matters worse. Newspapers like Josephus Daniels News and Observer in Raleigh repeatedly agitated inflammatory editorials that were designed to inflict fear and anger among white readers. These publications made black men to be perceived as threats to white women, and black political leaders as corrupt and incompetent individuals who were not qualified for the office. It was an approach that was carefully designed to destabilize the Fusionist coalition by turning white populists against their black allies. This growing racial tension created a tinderbox in Wilmington. At a glance, the city's government and thriving black community was a representation of their progress. But beneath what we see, white supremacists were mobilizing, determined to take back power and erode the interest of Reconstruction. The Fusionist Coalition was a partnership between black Republicans and white populists. This was both Wilmington's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. The coalition had been formed out of necessity as both groups shared a common enemy, the white Democratic elite. For some time, their alliance produced significant results. Together, they implemented policies that were beneficial to both black and white working-class citizens, like the reforms in education and infrastructure. This partnership was, however, insubstantial. While black leaders experienced fusionism as a gateway to greater equality, many white populists perceived it as a temporary compromise. Their loyalty to the coalition was often outweighed by their discomfort with black political power. When white Democrats began their campaign to dismantle fusionism, they exploited these tensions to fracture the alliance. The success of fusionists had also positioned them as a target for white supremacist violence. Black politicians faced threats and harassment, while black voters were often intimidated and oppressed at the polls. Regardless of these challenges, the fusionists managed to hold on to power, but their grip was not firm enough. In 1898, the stage was set for an extremely brutal confrontation. As the November elections of 1898 drew closer, Wilmington's black residents continued to push forward, even in the face of intense threats. The Daily Record published articles that challenged white supremacy and advocated for racial equality. Black business owners expanded their enterprises, and black families invested in their children's futures. But the tension in the air could not be hidden, as it has become obvious. Rumors of violence began to spread rapidly across the community, and white supremacist leaders openly called for the overthrow of the fusionist government. Despite their achievements, Wilmington's black residents knew they were living on borrowed time. Their progress had made them a target, and the forces of white supremacy were closing in. As the 19th century drew to a close, the political and social climate in the South was growing increasingly aggravated. However, despite the progress made by black Americans during Reconstruction, white supremacist groups and ideologies were rising to prominence, seeking to reverse those gains. The sole intention of this movement in North Carolina was the Democratic Party, which saw the integration and prosperity of black communities as a direct threat to their power and social status. Some white supremacist leaders like Furnifold Simmons and Charles Aycock came up with strategies to regain control of the state. Simmons, who was a skilled political organizer, was at the forefront, spearheading efforts to consolidate white voters by inflicting racial fear. Aycock, who is commonly known for his oratory skills, became a public face of the movement. They employed a fiery rhetoric to galvanize white citizens. They collectively orchestrated a campaign that combined political maneuvering with open calls for violence. The media was simply adding fuel to the fire. The editor of the influential News and Observer, Josephus Daniel, played a pivotal role in spreading white supremacist propaganda. The newspaper depicted black men as dangerous threats to white women and painted black politicians as corrupt and incompetent through inflammatory editorials and doctored images. These false narratives stoked white fears and intensified racial divides. This created an environment that would be a ground for conflict. The 1898 election became a pivotal event in North Carolina's history. Democrats were determined to overthrow the biracial fusionist government, a coalition of black Republicans and white populists that had held power since 1894. This coalition had implemented policies that were beneficial to both black citizens and poor whites. These policies challenged the traditional power dynamics of the South. To destroy this alliance, Democrats resorted to a campaign of intimidation, violence, and outright fraud. They mobilized a paramilitary group that was known as the Red Shirts. The Red Shirts was a violent offshoot of the Ku Klux Klan. These men patrolled black neighborhoods clothed in crimson uniforms, disrupting political meetings, threatening voters, and attacking those who resisted. Their presence had a clear message: black citizens and their allies were no longer safe. The Democrats' strategy went beyond physical violence. They weaponized voter suppression tactics to ensure black citizens could not exercise their political rights. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and property requirements were implemented to disenfranchise black voters under the pretense of law and order enforcement. This approach, coupled with the constant threat of violence, severely reduced the participation of black individuals in political affairs. On the day of the election, the Democrats' plan reached its peak. Armed redshirts and other white supremacists positioned themselves at polling places, just to intimidate black voters and even stuffing ballot boxes. The result was a foregone conclusion that the Democrats reclaimed control of the state legislature, setting the stage for the violent events that would follow. One unforgettable moment in the lead-up to the Wilmington Insurrection was the publication of a controversial editorial by Alex Manly, the editor of the Daily Record, Wilmington's black-owned newspaper. Manly's editorial, which was written in response to a speech by Rebecca Felton, a prominent white supremacist, challenged the existing narrative that black men were a threat to white women. Felton had claimed that white women were constantly under threat of assault by black men, and called for the lynching of any black man who was accused of such crimes. In his editorial, Manley exposed the hypocrisy of this argument, pointing out that many relationships between black men and white women were made by mutual consent of both parties. He also highlighted the systemic violence and exploitation black women faced at the hands of white men, an issue that white society refused to acknowledge. Manley's courage sparked outrage among white supremacists. The editorial was used as a rallying cry to justify the upcoming violence. White leaders narrated as an attack on white womanhood and Southern honor, whipping their followers into a frenzy. The publication became a symbol of everything they despised about black progress and defiance, further strengthening their resolve to crush Wilmington's black community. By the end of 1898, Wilmington had become a powder keg of racial tension. The fusionist government continued to hold power locally, despite the victories of the Democrats across the state. This local resistance infuriated white supremacist leaders who saw Wilmington as a final obstacle in their quest for total domination. Oftentimes, secret meetings were held among white leaders to plan the overthrow of the fusionist government. These meetings produced what came to be known as the White Declaration of Independence. This was a document that laid out their intentions to restore white supremacy by any means necessary. The declaration explicitly targeted black political leaders and institutions, demanding their immediate resignation and the removal of black citizens from positions of power and influence. The stage was set for a coup d'etat. The events that happened in Wilmington were not just sudden acts of violence, but the result of a meticulously planned and coordinated effort to put an end to black progress and reassert white dominance. With the groundwork laid and tensions at a breaking point, the city was on the brink of disaster. Let's go back to the early morning of November 10, 1898. Tension had been building in Wilmington for months, orchestrated by white supremacist leaders who were determined to overthrow the city's racially integrated government. That morning, their plans came to a violent implementation. At the center of the rage was the Daily Record, the only black-owned newspaper in North Carolina, led by editor Alexander Manley. The newspaper had become a symbol of black pride and progress, as well as a thorn in the side of white supremacists. Manley's bold editorial earlier that year challenged the racist myth that black men were predators, and defending interracial relationships had infuriated Wilmington's white population. That morning, a mob of armed white men marched to the Daily Record's office. They were determined to silence the voice of the paper once and for all. Over 500 mobs were led by Colonel Alfred Waddell, a former Confederate officer and one of the masterminds behind the insurrection. With torches in hand, they stormed the building and set it ablaze. Flames consumed not only the physical structure but also the voice of Wilmington's black community. This act of arson was more than just property destruction. It was a message that said dissent would not be tolerated. But the attack on the Daily Record was only the beginning. After torching the newspaper, the mob repositioned its attention towards the city's black residents, since they had silenced the voice that used to speak for them. Armed militias roamed the streets targeting black men indiscriminately. Gunfire rang out through Wilmington as groups of white men shot anyone they perceived as a threat. Eyewitness accounts described the scenes of chaos, black families fleeing their homes, many with nothing but the clothes on their backs, as the mob advanced, causing more violence. Although the estimates of the death toll vary, historians believe that the figure ranges between 60 to 300 black residents that were killed that day. A large number of the bodies were thrown into the Cape Fear River, erasing any evidence of the slaughter. The streets of Wilmington, once a bustling hub of black prosperity, were transformed into an unimaginable war zone. As violence began to spread even more, white supremacist leaders made their next move. They began to demolish Wilmington's government. They forced the city's black and white Republican officials to resign at gunpoint. Some of these people were Mayor Silas P. Wright and Police Chief John R. Melton. They were marched out of their offices under duress. In their place, Colonel Waddell and his allies installed themselves and occupied the positions of the new city government. This was not just a violent riot, it was a coup d'état, an intentional and organized overthrow of a legitimately elected government. For the first and only time in U.S. history, an American city's leadership was forcibly replaced in such a manner. The violence was an outrage they had long anticipated. It had been meticulously planned and executed by white supremacist militias, including groups like the Red Shirts. These militias had been strategizing for months, armed with rifles, pistols, and even Gatling guns. Their mission was clear: to terrorize Wilmington's black community and eliminate any challenge to white dominance. The Red Shirts and other groups operated with impunity. Law enforcement, which was complicit in the coup, did nothing to stop the violence. Many officers had a role to play in the attacks or gave way for the militia to cause havoc. Wilmington was now under the control of white supremacy, enforced through violence and fear. At the end of the day, Wilmington's black community was extremely devastated. Thousands of black residents fled out of the city in search of refuge in the surrounding swamps or leaving North Carolina. These refugees abandoned homes, businesses, and belongings, often never to return. The once thriving black middle class of Wilmington was shattered. Meanwhile, the new white supremacist government quickly moved to solidify its power. They passed ordinances to disenfranchise black voters and ensure that no black person could challenge their rule again. This was the beginning of Jim Crow laws in North Carolina, which would spread across the South and last for decades. Wilmington, which had been a pillar of black success during Reconstruction, has now been transformed into a city dominated by fear and oppression. Black residents who remained lived under constant threat, and their political and economic power were stripped away. The coup did not only destroy lives, but also erase the progress that had been made since the end of slavery. The events of November 10, 1898 were a turning point. They showed the lengths to which white supremacists would go to be in control and served as a blueprint for racial violence and voter suppression all over the South. The Wilmington Insurrection was not just a local tragedy, but a national crisis that revealed how fragile democracy is in the face of systemic racism. Days and weeks after the coup, white leaders worked to control the narrative. They framed the events as a race riot, casting the blame for the violence on black residents. This false narrative was widely circulated in newspapers and historical accounts, deleting the truth of what happened in Wilmington. For decades, the story of the Wilmington Insurrection was never talked about. It wasn't taught in schools or acknowledged in public discourse. The descendants of those who lived through the coup were left to piece together their history, often with little more than oral traditions and fragmented records. The silence surrounding Wilmington was intentional. It allowed white supremacists to maintain their grip on power and ensured that the lessons of the insurrection would remain hidden. But the suppressed truth could not be erased forever. The Wilmington Insurrection of 1898, often described as the only successful coup d'état in the history of America, left a profound and far-reaching impact that influenced the social, political, and economic fabric of the South, and arguably the entire nation for generations. Its effects resonated not only in the lives of those who were directly affected, but also in the broader structure of systemic racism and white supremacy that continues to influence American society today. One of the most stealthy aspects of the Wilmington Insurrection is its deliberate misrepresentation and erasure from mainstream historical accounts. In the immediate aftermath, white leaders and the press began to paint the events as a race riot, rather than a planned attack of a legitimate government that it was. This narrative shifted blame onto the black community and also reinforced the white supremacist idea that African Americans were inherently unruly and a threat to social order. Newspapers like Josephus Daniels News and Observer propagated this false narrative, describing the coup as a necessary act of restoring peace and order. This framing lasted for decades, solidifying a distorted version of events in public awareness. School textbooks in North Carolina and across the nation either omitted the insurrection entirely or emphasized the race riot narrative. The result was a widespread lack of awareness about the true nature of the event and its implications. It wasn't until the late 20th century, with the work of historians and activists, that the truth began to emerge. Even today, efforts to fully acknowledge and teach this history face severe resistance and opposition, highlighting the enduring discomfort with confronting the darker chapters of America's past. The Wilmington Insurrection devastated the Black community in ways that were both immediate and had a long-lasting effect. Economically, the coup stripped Black residents of their wealth, livelihoods, and opportunities. Before 1898, Wilmington had been a thriving hub for Black entrepreneurship and middle-class prosperity. Black-owned businesses like the Daily Record symbolized progress and independence. However, the destruction of these institutions and the violent displacement of their owners and patrons effectively erased decades of economic progression. Thousands of Black residents fled Wilmington in the days and weeks after the coup, leaving their homes, businesses, and lands behind. This event disrupted lives, but also created a vacuum that white residents quickly filled. Property and businesses were often seized by white elites, further increasing their economic dominance. For those Black families who remained, the barriers to economic success became nearly insurmountable, something they couldn't fathom. Systemic discrimination in employment, education, and housing ensured that the Black community could not rebuild its prosperity to the way it used to. Politically, the coup marked the beginning of a new era of disenfranchisement and exclusion for African Americans in North Carolina and beyond. The white supremacist government that took over in Wilmington after the coup wasted no time in enacting policies that stripped Black citizens of their political rights and power. Jim Crow laws like literacy tests, poll taxes, and grandfather clauses were implemented to suppress Black voter turnout and participation. The ripple effects of these policies were felt far beyond Wilmington. The success of the insurrection emboldened white supremacists across the South, leading to a wave of voter suppression and racial violence. The Democratic Party, which had orchestrated the coup, used Wilmington as a blueprint for maintaining white dominance through fear and intimidation. In 1900, Black political representation in North Carolina had been effectively destroyed, and the state became a stronghold of segregation and disenfranchisement. The economic and political consequences of the insurrection also tampered with cultural dynamics. The narrative of Black inferiority, which was reinforced by the coup and its aftermath, became deeply embedded in Southern society. This ideology justified the exclusion of Black people from economic and political life and the systemic violence and discrimination they faced daily. Wilmington's Black community was left marginalized and impoverished, its potential suppressed by the weight of systemic oppression. The Wilmington Insurrection solidified white supremacy as the dominant social and political force in North Carolina, and its legacy encroaches into the present day. One of the most significant aspects of this legacy is the psychological impact on both Black and white communities. For Black residents, the insurrection created a deep sense of fear and vulnerability. The knowledge that their lives, livelihoods, and even their government could be destroyed at the whim of white supremacists was a powerful deterrent to resistance. This fear was compounded by the lack of accountability for the perpetrators. This reinforces the idea that justice was unattainable for African Americans. For white communities, the coup validated the ideology that violence and intimidation were effective tools for maintaining racial hierarchies. It also normalized the idea that Black people could be excluded from public life without any consequence. This mindset permeated Southern society, influencing attitudes and policies for generations. The legacy of the insurrection can be seen in the systemic inequalities that endure today, from wealth disparities and educational inequities to the ongoing challenges of voter suppression and racial profiling. The cultural effect of the coup is also seen in the way it has been remembered, or more accurately, forgotten. This erasure has denied Black Americans their rightful place in history and also fostered the myth of white superiority. However, efforts to confront this legacy have gained momentum in recent years. Historians, educators, and activists are working tirelessly to expose the truth about the Wilmington Insurrection and to share it with a global audience. Their research has challenged the hidden narratives of the past and shed light on the systemic injustices that formed American society. The Wilmington Insurrection serves as a reminder of the consequences of unchecked racism and the importance of confronting hidden historical truths. Its legacy highlights the essence of systemic change and the ongoing struggle for racial justice. The long-term effect of the Wilmington Insurrection of 1898 is a testament to the destructive power of white supremacy and the resilience of those who have fought against it. The event's erasure and misrepresentation highlight the importance of preserving and teaching accurate history, which has rarely been done. While we reflect on the damages and lessons in this dark chapter in American history, it is important to remember that the fight for justice and equality is still ongoing. The story of Wilmington is not just a cautionary tale, but also a call to action. A reminder that the past influences the present, and that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and inclusive society. Historians, journalists, and descendants of those affected have played crucial roles in reviving back the layers of distortion. One of the most significant breakthroughs came in the early 21st century when the North Carolina General Assembly commissioned a report on the Wilmington events. The report, which was published in 2006, meticulously documented the events of 1898 and offered an unflinching look at the racial motivations and political machinations that led to the coup. This report corrected the historical record and shed light on the economic and social ramifications for Wilmington's black population. Some scholars like David Zucchino, author of Wilmington's Lie, The Murderous Coup of 1898 and the Rise of White Supremacy, have further amplified the story. Zucchino's Pulitzer Prize-winning work was a blend of rigorous research and compelling narrative to bring the insurrection to life for modern audiences. His book highlights the systemic nature of the violence and its enduring impact on race relations in America. Additionally, documentaries and media coverage have also played a vital role in educating the public. Films like Wilmington on Fire by Christopher Everett delve deep into the personal stories of those who lived through the insurrection and their descendants. These works provided a visual of the historical context but also emotional resonance, reminding us that history is not merely about dates and events, but about people, their lives, dreams, and struggles. Community organizations and grassroots movements in Wilmington have also been instrumental in preserving the memory of 1898. In recent years, there have been concerted efforts to confront the legacy of the Wilmington Insurrection. In 2007, the state of North Carolina formally apologized for its role in enabling and perpetuating the violence. While symbolic, this acknowledgement was a significant step in addressing a painful chapter of the state's history. Local leaders in Wilmington have also taken steps to honor the victims and their descendants. In 2019, the city unveiled a memorial at the site of the Daily Record, the Black-owned newspaper that was destroyed during the coup. The memorial stands as a testament to the resilience of Wilmington's Black community and a dark, gloomy reminder of the consequences of unchecked racism and political ambition. The question of reparations and restorative justice has been a controversial topic that has been discussed with no yielding resolve. Advocates argue that the economic devastation inflicted on the Black community, the loss of businesses, property, and generational wealth demands concrete compensation. Some have called for financial compensation to the descendants of those affected, while others emphasize the need for systemic changes, such as investments in education and economic development, for Wilmington's Black population. Although there have been discussions, critics of reparations often face the challenges of implementation and the passage of time. Yet proponents counter that the enduring effects of the insurrection, which was manifested in racial disparities in wealth, education, and political representation, make reparative actions not only justified, but necessary. In recent years, younger generations have taken up the mantle of activism, pushing for a more inclusive narrative of Wilmington's history. Through social media campaigns, educational initiatives, and public demonstrations, they are ensuring that the lessons of the 1898 event resonate in the 21st century.